Okay, welcome everybody to today's Newsmaker interview. Just want to remind you, if you get on Facebook and say that you are here, attended these interviews, you can go back to Chelsea over the table and get a free granola bar. So, I'm really excited today to have Stephen Mansfield with us, interviewing with Dr. Olasky. He has a BA, 2 MAs, a doctorate. He's led a church. He's done many things, but he's most well known as a biographer. In fact, as a biographer who really focuses on the impact of faith in the lives of some important people. Let me just read some of his titles. Never Give In, The Extraordinary Character of Winston Churchill. Then Darkness Fled, The Liberating Philosophy of Booker T. Washington. The Forgotten Founding Father, The Heroic Life of George Whitefield, The Faith of George W. Bush, which is a best-selling book that won numerous awards and that was made into a movie partially by Oliver Stone, no less. The Faith of the American Soldier, Pope Benedict XVI, His Life and Mission, The Faith of Barack Obama, The Search for God and Guinness, Where Has Oprah Taken Us? The Religious Impact of the World's Most Famous Woman, The Mormonizing of America, Lincoln's Battle with God, and most recently, Killing Jesus, an account of the trial and execution of Christ. His latest project is a book that will be released in just about a week and a half. It will be entitled Mansfield Book of Manly Men, a book that exhorts men to build a culture of manliness and nobility that will be passed along to younger generations. So, again, very happy to have him here. Please welcome Stephen Mansfield.
Thanks, guys. We're going to move fast over this next half hour or so, as I'll be asking questions about just a whole bunch of books. Going to move fast. I mean, yesterday and the day before, if you were here, we had interviews that basically looked at one book for each author. But here we're going to be dancing around all these, starting with your first book, Winston Churchill. Okay, what should these students here know about Winston Churchill? Perhaps you can tell us in 50 words or less?
No, I can't. The thing I want you to most know about Churchill, because you'll hear all the greatness of him throughout your life, is how much he suffered and how much he had to conquer or stand down the demons in the dark night of the soul. He was suffered horrible black dog depressions. His father hated him. He had one child commit suicide during his lifetime. One died in infancy. 2 drank themselves to death. He was hated in his country. Even when he was prime minister of his country, he didn't want to stay in a room with a balcony on it because he was afraid a depression might hit. He might throw himself off. So all the public greatness of Churchill, all the rallying of the West and great World War II speeches and so on, you'll hear about. But the man had to conquer himself against very desperate forces in his own soul and life before he could achieve greatness. And I think it was because he mined the valleys that he had something to offer the West at a time of crisis. So that's what I'd most want you to know. That wasn't 50 words, I'm sorry.
That's good. But
at least I talk fast. That helps.
But he knew about fighting on the landing strips and on the beaches because he had to do that through his own life against the own devils that...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he had to overcome everything from stuttering to a father who hated him to his own depression and other issues, and even being inherently a coward, he said, when he first went into battle. All of those things he had to conquer. But you can see a direct connection between winning those battles and what he offered to the world in the great contest.
Okay. William Wilberforce.
William Wilberforce, I think that enduring hardship to the very end is what most impresses me about Wilberforce. Again, we tend to use sort of the banners over people's lives and remember them that way. But the personal struggles of some of these people is heartrending. And Wilberforce took a beating in every possible way to do what he did. And we should remember that, because to do likewise in our own generation, we may have to take similar beatings.
And tell us a little bit about how he persevered for decades with his one great goal of ending slavery.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating. We tend to think maybe he did a year or 2 year campaign, and this took decades of his life. He had the consensus of the country was absolutely against him. Even some of the folks that he teamed with would later change their minds, reverse themselves, be against his own views. It took decades for him to get there, and I think quite literally killed him. I think he died sick and early because of these great struggles. So we just need to count the price. We do the righteous thing, but we've got to count the price.
Booker T. Washington, I think Up From Slavery is one of the great books of America,
I do too.
And it's very sad that he's pretty much ignored these days, and even in Black History Month, he doesn't get the attention. But tell us a little bit about him.
Booker T. Washington was born a slave and then later taught himself to read and bought into a view taught by some white evangelical founders of institutions for African Americans that the black man, so to speak, had his freedom. Now he needed to become of value to the society. What Booker T. Washington saw was that newly freed slaves sometimes went to spend all their money on clothes or all their money on what Booker T. Washington called gewgaws, which would be, junk stuff that just felt people feel rich or better about themselves. He said, no, let's become people of value. And the reason he's not so popular is it sounds very harsh and hurtful and disparaging of African Americans today. He at Tuskegee Institute, which he founded, he would first teach them how to make their beds and brush their teeth. Well, that sounds silly, but many of them had only known slavery and had never been taught basic cleanliness. So he started there. And then he had one of them all to know a trade, whatever else they majored in. So they might major in history, but they're going to know how to lay bricks. They might major in English, but they were going to know how to, work in some other practical trade like painting. Well, the nation needed him, but ultimately, of course, he gets overshadowed by the battle for civil rights, W.E.B. Du Bois, and all that we know of Dr. King. So his message actually is one that African Americans are advancing on today. Today, it's African Americans doing well in the market that's increasing, their visibility, acceptance, etc. The number of African American millionaires is increasing, at least at last count, more rapidly than for any other ethnic group. So his message was prophetic, it was early, it was necessary, but he's been diminished in academic studies largely because of the fact that the more intriguing, more recent civil rights battle, the films we see, Eyes on the Prize, things like that, have sort of put him in disfavor temporarily. But he's making a comeback, and I'm expecting my book to be on the Times list eventually. Not really.
Is he making a comeback?
He is. He actually is. There's actually going to be a PBS doc about him pretty soon. And again, if you're Spike Lee, you may have benefited in your life from the battle for civil rights, but you have become Booker T. Washington, in order to do well. So they're seeing the blending of the two rather than civil rights or character and labor. And so he is making a dramatic comeback, hopefully on the wings of my book, which is what I'm hoping for. Not really.
But correct me if I'm misremembering this, but in Up From Slavery at one point he writes, just after he got to Tuskegee, he did a ride around. I mean, somewhat, I suppose, like Nehemiah riding around the walls of Jerusalem, did a ride around and came across one cabin that was trash strewn. And there was a guy in it, an African-American who apparently was well-educated, and he was reading either a French grammar or a book in French. But everywhere around him was just rubbish and so forth. And he took that as an example of what not to do.
Exactly. A lot of the slave masters delighted in teaching their slaves Latin, French, Greek, the stuff of Bullfinch's mythology. But these people couldn't cook their own meals. They didn't know anything about basic health. They didn't know anything about even just cleaning the trash. They didn't know that trash was an issue if they or living in with the animals might bring disease, things like that. And it can sound real bigoted and negative about African Americans to say so, but if you've been in slavery only for a century or more, how would you know if nobody taught you? But it was to the entertainment of the slave masters sometimes to have an intelligent slave to talk to about French literature. So they could discourse in French about French literature, but couldn't dress themselves adequately. And he said, listen, I don't care how insulting it sounds. We're going to teach people how to brush their teeth, shower, make their bed, and deal with diseases, and how to speak English and paint a wall. They're going to know how to do that stuff if they don't know anything else. And it was necessary.
Before you wrote your first best-selling book, The Faith of George W. Bush, were there others? Have I missed something?
I had written the book on Churchill, Booker T, George Whitefield. I wrote a book that a lot of homeschoolers use and Christian schools use called More Than Dates and Dead People. It's kind of a Christian view of history and with some humor and sass. I can't seem to get away from that. And I also, by God's grace, was asked to write the official history of religion for Tennessee during that state's bicentennial. So,
okay, tell us a little bit about Whitefield.
George Whitefield, I call the book Forgotten Founding Father because you have many founding fathers, but George Whitefield is the man who came and he led revivals, religious revivals. He was an Anglican priest, led religious revivals really from Georgia all the way up to what is now Maine. And scholars call him the first intercolonial event. If you had lived in the Carolinas, you were as far away from New York as if you'd lived in London. There was no nation here. There was individual colonies. And George Whitefield did two or three things. First, he led a revival that unified the colonies. Second of all, he preached liberty, both political and religious. He specifically in his sermons warned the colonists that King George was, quote unquote, spying out their liberties. And he built institutions to perpetuate the Christian faith. He printed magazines, started orphanages, started schools, things of that nature. So he was a biblical worldview reformer at a time when people wouldn't have used that phrase. And I think he's as much a founding father as any of them. One little quick story. When he was buried up in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Before some of the troops marched out, they went to his tomb, opened his grave, and tore off just little pieces of his preaching robe or his garments and pinned them to their hats. It was sort of as a good luck charm. But during the Revolution, these would be traded, bought, sold, and prized, and often put under glass after the Revolution because they really did think that George Whitefield spiritually was the father of the American Revolution. So that's a quick overview.
That's very good. George W. Bush, tell us about him and his faith.
He was president long before you were born, most of you. George W. Bush grew up in an American Episcopalian home. Faith was assumed, not much discussed. It was not incredibly warm. Joke about the American Episcopalians is they were God's chosen frozen. That's now moved to the Presbyterians, sorry to say, since I are one. And I think that by the time he had begun to step out professionally, he was a guy who was drinking hard, resented his father's success, resented growing up in his father's shadow, and had not become settled either as a man or as a Christian. But I think right before he went into office, right before he was elected president, he had maybe in the 2 years before, a profound change spiritually. He had not been well taught or discipled. He had not been well instructed in theology, which is why we heard some of the statements later that he made in office that I think he's even said he came to regret that he made, about evolution and things of that nature. But I think you had a serious evangelical Christian as president of the United States. Doesn't mean everything he did was perfect. Doesn't mean that he had fully thought through every issue of doctrine, or that he insisted that everyone else be evangelical in his administration. But I think that George W. Bush represents the better nature of the religious right, the evangelical world at that time, better than anybody else on the public stage at that time. That's how we should see him. So,
now you had that book with the title "The Faith of George W. Bush." You can bookend it with another book you wrote, "The Faith of Barack Obama." Mm-hmm. Compare the two.
I was backslidden for a long season, and no, I took a lot of heat for writing The Faith of Barack Obama, but it's my view, it was my view then, it's my view now, that Barack Obama was as faith-based as George W. Bush, just a different kind of faith. And people, the joke that people always want to tell me when I say I've written The Faith of Barack Obama, they say, well, that must have been a short book. And I understand what they're thinking, but the fact is that just because a person doesn't share my faith or your faith doesn't mean that the key to understanding them is not their faith. I think that Barack Obama today is is doing what he's doing in office based on a theology that he has absorbed from a range of people, from Jeremiah Wright to Joshua Du Bois to even some of the evangelicals who are around him today. So if you're going to understand him, if you're going to anticipate him, if you're going to contend with him or against him, you need to understand this theology that he's executing. So I wrote that book. I've updated it since. I'm completely convinced that he is, for lack of a better term at the moment, a very liberal Christian. And to not understand that is to not understand what's pulsating at the heart of his administration.
Now, J. Gresham Machen wrote a book in 1924 called Christianity and Liberalism, talking about theological liberalism and essentially saying these are two different religions. Do we see the exemplars in some way of these two different religions in Bush and Obama?
I do, except that I would say, and I'm no advocate for the current president. Please don't misunderstand. We're friends, but I'm no advocate. I think that he is further along internally on towards an evangelical journey, while externally continuing to be on the extreme end of theological and political liberalism. I know that's difficult to understand. You'd have to know the evangelicals around him, what he's willing to receive, how he's willing to talk, how he's willing to pray, the people he wants to pastor him. And then sure enough, the next week he'll walk right out and make an astonishing statement about gay rights or something that you just can't believe is coming from somebody who reads the Bible. So the bottom line is you do have two polarities here. The only thing I want to remind you of, and as much for urging prayer, since I'm a Christian and believe in that, as anything else, and that is that something's going on in Barack Obama where he's in tension between some kind of an evangelical influence and his traditional theological liberalism. He's a work in progress, but yeah, publicly he's representing the extreme edge of liberalism, theological liberalism right now.
So, for example, when he came out for same-sex marriage and so forth, he was a little bit torn in that in some ways, or at least was apologetic to one of his spiritual mentors.
There's a spiritual advisor, I won't mention his name, but one of his main spiritual advisors, very well known, with whom I'm good friends, and he told me later, he said, when I heard this on the radio, I pulled over and wept because I'd had no indication that this is where the president was going. I'd prayed with him, we talked about this issue, we'd studied scripture on this issue. I thought he was going the other way. I heard the announcement, I pulled over to the side of the road to weep because I couldn't keep driving, and just then the phone rang. And the president called and said, you must be disappointed in me, I'm sorry. And when I heard this, I was mystified because, first of all, a president who has just acted in such an astonishing way shouldn't really be calling anyone and saying, well, I'm sorry you're disappointed in me. You know, it's sort of little boy stuff.
Lyndon Johnson would not do that.
No, Lyndon Johnson would have said, I did it, and your mama. And Barack Obama starts calling the people he knows who are significant in his life who don't like what he's done and apologizing. So it's a you see what I mean? There's a little boyish, little bit of polarity, kind of insecurity in there, and I think it hides the fact that he's a work in progress. I won't be as surprised at all if he ends his life more in sort of a traditional Christian mode, looking back on some of his decisions and regretting it. That's what I'm praying anyway. But right now he's bouncing around on the inside of himself, and you can see that. He goes to the National Prayer Breakfast and sounds like Billy Graham. And then 2 months later, he's in progress in the opposite direction from the National Prayer Breakfast, majority of the National Prayer Breakfast people, on the issue of homosexuality. So this is what you're dealing with as president.
So he's in the social gospel tradition.
Yeah,
it seems that way.
That's
and must,
at least on Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
Right.
And then Thursdays, yeah, but he is. There's no.
And on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, he must believe it strongly because any other political leader, I mean, in recent times, for example, Hillary Clinton, facing the degree of opposition he faced originally and just being able to barely get through what we now know as Obamacare. And right now, there'd be a tendency to back off in some way and try to come to some compromise, but he just seems so determined.
He is determined. I mean, you know, we have to look back on the shutdown and realize that a lot of what some folks on the right wanted was simply a delay. Could you just hold off 6 months and rolling out Obamacare? Well, now it's going to be delayed 6 months, whether Mr. Obama likes it or not. Why not concede? But no, he, as recently as last night, you know, he continues to push, continues to say, well, we were right, and the negative things that are happening were just sort of unintended consequences of doing the right thing. But some other president might have said, hey, let's stop this, or let's go ahead and make sure that by executive order that you can have your original doctor or medical plan. There's a combination of apologizing and stubbornness that's hard to contend with and certainly hard to get behind, at least from my perspective. But it really is rooted in the soul of a man who's in tension with himself spiritually and is very practiced at being nice and getting along with people. He's very personable. You'd like him if he was sitting here. He wouldn't sit here long, given what I'm saying, but he would. You know, he might join us for a while.
So, between writing about the faith of George W. Bush and the faith of Barack Obama, you also wrote about the faith of the American soldier. So you have a collective faith there, or tell us what you found out there.
Yeah, I had written The Faith of George W. Bush, and it had done very, very well. And so a publisher came to me and said, what would you like to write next? And at that time, some of you may not recall, we were seeing newspaper articles in the New York Times about Marine units being baptized in the sands of Iraq, and units voluntarily listening to Michael W. Smith Christian rock music before they went into the field, and that there was sort of a low-grade revival happening among people who weren't real churched when they were back here. And this was interesting because this was the first war involving the millennials. And they were absolutely blowing the minds of the commanders. I attended seminars and taught some things at West Point, and the commanders were saying, these are as fine a troops as we've ever put in the field. And in fact, they were a bit older and more educated than those we'd fought with in Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam was a non-volunteer army. It was the draft. So I got permission, got in bed, even though I'm not a journalist, I got embedded with the troops and spent some time over there, traveling around, flying around, and had all the harrowing experiences that some of the other journalists have, and looking as stupid in a helmet and a vest as Geraldo ever does. But I really did see that what is true, I think, in every war, and that is that soldiers are almost always making some deeper religious journey. May not be traditional, may not be Christian, but some deeper religious journey. They have to deal with the morality of killing the other side. They have to deal with the grief of the death of their friends. They have to deal with the theological issues of just war in some form, even if they wouldn't define it that way, Augustinian terms. And so there was a real deep religious thing happening among many of the troops. Now, I walked into a prayer meeting on the second day, and the troops were all decked out to go out in the field. Couldn't hold hands, so they butted fists and started to pray. And it went something like this. I won't use the language they used, but, "Oh, Lord, we thank you for this blanking day, and we want you to help us blank these blankers up for your blanking glory." Whoa, whoa, whoa. I was not sure if I was in like a strip bar back in the States or a prayer meeting, but these were unchurched 19, 20, 21-year-olds who were having a profound experience with Jesus in a real way and had never been discipled or churched. And it really sort of captured to me the possibilities of this generation. So I wrote the whole book describing their experiences, describing the religious influences, even some of the issues of, what do you do when a soldier is more influenced by what's going on Fox and CNN on the big screen TV in the dining hall than he or she is shaped by their commander's philosophy or their chaplain's input or maybe even their own beliefs before they got to war. So the nature of warfare is changing, and it's becoming more religious, and yet it's also becoming more non-traditionally religious. And so part of command, I keep saying at the Naval Academy in West Point, is that you're going to have to contend with these, unique religious views that a soldier's getting from podcasts and television and so on that may be contrary to the doctrine of the country or the military philosophy in that particular war. And it's going to be a complex issue. So anyway, my book, Faith of the American Soldier, was all about the new configuration of war religiously and generationally. And it was a real honor to write that.
So which of those views that they're getting from television do you find most influential in their lives?
I find their non-traditional religion, this religious pastiche that a lot have. They will love Jesus, check their horoscopes, believe in the vegetarianism of a Tibetan monk, believe in the positive speak of a Deepak Chopra, and maybe be as mystically oriented as the Dalai Lama. And all of that gets packaged together with a couple of fortune cookies and some Yoda. And now they bring that onto the battlefield. What does that mean for how they're going to fight? What does that mean for what they believe about the other side? Conversely, if I am a soldier and I am only listening to the podcasts of a rather radical anti-Muslim pastor of a megachurch in pick a city, Dallas, I might be more vicious in my fight, more vicious in how I pull the trigger, more vicious in how I command my squad in a Muslim, Western context. All of that comes to play, and commanders used to be able to ignore the issue of religion. Protestant, Catholic, Jew, boom, done. Nothing really affected the war. But now you can literally have a soldier with an iPad on or his iPhone, with the earbuds, and he's getting a completely doctrine of the war than the military wants him to believe, and yet this is his First Amendment right. But it's going to affect how he actually fights in the field. All of this is more complex than ever, and thank God the major military academies are recognizing it. And so not only do I get to speak there occasionally, it's a very great privilege, but it's something that they're starting to absorb more and talk about more.
So chaplains then are crucially important insofar as how unformed many of the soldiers are, but are a lot of theologically orthodox chaplains essentially being forced out now?
A lot of theologically orthodox chaplains are being forced out, and a lot of them are having their hands tied. Almost every other day there's a new ACLU lawsuit about what a chaplain can do, can't do. And I had a Jewish chaplain at West Point who is just back from the field. And he would be happy to stand right here and tell you this, so I'm not telling you any tales out of school. As I'm asking him about his ability to minister to his troops, he stood up and started throwing chairs around the room. He was livid. He was in the Army, and he couldn't cross the wire. He couldn't go out with his troops and endure what they endured. While Navy chaplains can, because they're with Marines. Two different branches of our military, different approaches to chaplains. Then the chaplain could not, in one case, was not allowed to help the commander understand Islam, so the commander had kind of a Bubba kind of South Georgia, and I'm from South Georgia, so I don't mean anything with Georgia, but you understand what I mean, kind of a Bubba version of what Islam is, and he was messing things up because he wouldn't let the chaplain teach him. The chaplain had a doctorate in the field. Then the chaplains couldn't address the whole just war theory. They're not allowed to do that. Well, that's what most of the troops are wrestling with. You know, should we be over here? Should we be fighting this thing? Killed 3 people yesterday. Is that a righteous thing? And chaplains aren't allowed to address that. Well, after a while, chaplains can just make the sign of the cross and hand out communion, and that's it. They can't address any of the pressing issues in people's lives. And as you millennials know, you guys are asking raw questions. You want to know reality. You want it to be right there. And so chaplains have First Amendment constraints, and then they have sort of mission constraints. Many of the Orthodox are leaving, and those who are staying are very, very, very restricted and very frustrated. So we're going to see some kind of a contest happen in the military, and then, of course, the whole ruling about don't ask, don't tell, moving more openly about gay rights has caused a lot of the Orthodox chaplains to leave. So it's a real issue. It's going to continue for a while.
Okay, I got to ask, tell us about your most harrowing experience.
I will do that. I hate to do it because I was over there for less than a month, and I don't want to act like I'm, the great hero. I was in a chopper that took fire. Now, I've been on the ground at some fire bases that got mortared and so on, but, you've got 9 feet of sandbags, and it's almost like a gentle massage in a sense. The chair is kind of shaking lightly. It's not that I don't
put in a
make
quarter and you get attacked in that way, or no?
Yeah. Pardon?
Never mind.
You feel real safe when you're in a chopper that's already swirling around, and you see that thing you see in the movies where it takes a stripe of like a stripe of bullets pierce the thing. That has the power to concentrate the mind, and so you strap yourself in tightly, and then the pilot does things that will never be done on Delta. Let's just say that never be done on American. And you're on the ground real quick, and then you're shoved out. They know they got to take care. They shove you out the door and drag you to the nearest defense. And I'm 6'4" at about 270. And feel pretty competent physically. I felt like a baby in a car seat with these guys. They didn't wait to ask permission. They grabbed me by the belt, picked me up, and threw me in protection, because the last thing they were going to do is lose a journalist. That's what they talk about all the time. I'm not going to lose a journalist. No journalist is going to be lost on my watch. Thank you. I appreciate you caring about me. So that was the most harrowing for me. The one other thing was what's called the corkscrew landing. When you come in, they don't want the plane to come in gradually because a missile could take it out. So they go way high, and the pilot banks the C-130 completely wing down, and you spiral in like that real fast. And when I looked over and saw the Air Force 3-star general, he was either shouting in tongues, Latin, or some other version of something I couldn't quite understand. And he's in the Air Force. I knew I was, either having the most dramatic experience of my life or about to die. But we landed just fine, and these guys deal with this all the time. So what little I experienced is just a little tad of what they're experiencing all the time.
So here's your new book again.
Yes.
Mansfield's Book of Manly Men. Did that help? Did the Iraq experience help to?
Yes, because when I went to Iraq, a lot of the male soldiers had not really been mentored in any kind of a manliness in any way that was understood. They knew how to be macho. They knew how to go to clubs or whatever, but many of them fatherless, many of them churchless. If they hadn't had a football coach who was decent or something, they didn't know anything about it. And that's what got me really thinking about manhood in this generation. I spent a lot of time dialoguing, millennials, looking at it, studying it. I love what happened in the men's movement of a generation ago or so, whole Coach McCartney thing. But it was largely baby boomer, and it was largely therapeutic. Boomers were very therapeutic about everything. So wonderful as it was, it often said to men, get whole, and then you can be a great husband. Well, that's not always the best news to a man. Because if I have to get whole, if I have to heal up from whatever my father might have done to me before I can be a great husband, we're going to be waiting a long time. Millennials are saying, just tell me what to do. I'm sure there's some healing needed out there, but just tell me what to do. Nobody's ever told me what a man does. So I decided to cut to the chase here. Not real therapeutic. I'm not about a lot about talk. I actually pick on some of our Christian conferences that are talk, go home. Well, did anybody actually change their behavior in any way? So I have fun with being kind of sarcastic. And then I look at the lives of some great men and sort of distill out some principles. Mainly I'm about doing. I just say manhood's about the doing. The healing will come. Theories will come later. This is what you do to be a man. And so far, the book's not even really officially out, but the young millennial men who have read are really rallying to it because finally someone's telling us what to do, So I'm very excited about that book.
And you're writing a book now on Kurdistan.
Yeah.
Tell us about the Kurds.
I was the pastor of a large church in Nashville, Tennessee, when the Kurds began to pour into Nashville after the Gulf War. And obviously, large church felt responsibility. We taught them English and how to drive and get jobs and driver's licenses and so on. And they began to beg us to go back to Kurdistan and minister to their family members. So we formed an NGO, and we did. And I spent years and years going in and out through Turkey and through Syria, into northern Iraq, into Kurdistan, working with the Kurds. All kinds of adventure stories there. I'm not Lawrence of Arabia, but it felt like that at some times. And I think the progress the Kurds have made is amazing. As a matter of fact, what most Americans wanted to happen with the Gulf War is happening amongst the Kurds in northern Iraq. They've got Safeways nicer than yours. They've got 6-star hotels. I was sitting in the religion minister's office when the decision finally came down from the assembly that no longer would the public schools of northern Iraq now, Kurdistan, be required, the students would no longer be required to essentially be Muslims to graduate. They would teach all religions. You would not have to pass a Muslim test, they called it. So you'd be knowledgeable in all religions, but you could be anything. There's a Jewish woman in the government of Kurdistan. Christians, Yazidis, every kind of Syrian Catholics, every kind of thing. So you have a budding democracy in northern Iraq and in Kurdistan amongst the Kurds, and when you combine that with the oil money they are building a society of which Forbes magazine said is one of the top 15 vacation spots in the world. Now, it wasn't but a decade ago we were doing a no-fly zone to keep Saddam from gassing them all to death. So they have dramatically grown, done amazing things. And my book is called, if the publisher leaves it alone, my book will be called A People Whose Time Has Come. I'm advocating for a Kurdish nation that I think will really help turn the Middle East and be a tribute to not only their efforts, but yes, the efforts of the West in protecting them and nurturing that progression along.
So the tourist planes will not be spiraling.
I got to tell you, I risked, literally, and not trying to paint myself in heroic terms, I risked my life to get into Iraq during all the terrible times. And the last time I went, which was last August, I was on a great big 747. I got upgraded. You know how awesome that is. And I'm flying in, and I started to weep because you're coming into Erbil. Well, I almost got killed in Erbil. Nobody even knew who I was. I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Machine gun fire broke out on the streets. This is before. Now I'm on a luxury jet. They got this great big new airport. The baklava stands are like pretty much proof the millennium is coming. Baklavas, I think, is manna today. And it's awesome. And when you see the difference in a decade, you just weep. So keep your eye on the Kurds, and I'll hopefully get this book out next year, middle of next year.
Now, I read that you're contemplating a new series of mystery novels set in biblical cities. Is that still on?
It is on. It is on. I think that, obviously, in our postmodern society, story is one of the main ways of communicating truth. And I really think the Bible is often taught in very dry ways, dull ways. And one of the best ways to bring the story to the fore and the drama is to understand this history just behind the words, just behind the story, more than you have in the introduction to your study Bible to each of the books, but some of the history. And I thought, now I'd like to address that. I'd like to help this generation with that. How can I do that? Well, if I wrote a New Testament history, none of you would read it. Don't lie. None of you would read it. But if I can take that same history and actual street names, actual cultures, actual foods, actual values, cults, what have you, imperial cults, and embed a murder mystery in it, make it a ripping good yarn, as the British say, well, then I might have something you guys would read. And so that's what I'm hoping for, is painless New Testament, Old Testament historical education inside a ripping good yarn. So I've got to learn to dribble with my left hand to write fiction, because I just cannot tell a lie. And when you can't lie, you can't write fiction. So now I'm having to learn how to lie, really, is what it amounts to. And hopefully I'll get that out. We've got 8 contracted, so you'll be hearing from me for a long time on that subject.
Go to your questions in a minute, but I just want to ask one more. That you've said that neither of your parents were deeply devoted Christians. You attended a kind of generic Protestant service for years and so forth. How has God worked on you, and how has God worked on you with these particular experiences He's given you? How has that changed your...
I became a Christian, turning down a college football scholarship, which was no big deal to play, to go to Christian. I became a Christian, then went to a Christian school, went straight into pastoring, and pastored for 21 years after I went to this Christian school. Now, I was very blessed and pastored huge influential churches because I was brought along up into the leadership and so on, not because I started them. And I'm very grateful for all of that. But when I transitioned out in 2003 and began to write books like The Faith of George W. Bush, and go be with soldiers and go sit with the mullah of Iraq and all of that kind of thing, and be in some gritty situations, I began to realize something that all of you know, and I'm not trying to hammer the church, but that often we are not relevant to where a lot of people are living. And to international situations. So the thing that has most profoundly shaped me is had a radical conversion experience when I was 18, went to a wonderful Christian university, pastored 2 wonderful churches for 21 years. And when I began to do the things I've just been describing through the lens of these books, I began to realize that there's a whole other way that we need to be functioning to be of impact in this world. I love the church, but the church is where we're mentored and trained and brought into the presence of Jesus and developed. Some of us are called to work in the church, not the majority of us. The majority of us are meant to be out beyond the 4 walls of the church, having an impact. And so I think what's caused sort of a personal revival in my life in the last years is sitting with those soldiers, or sitting with people on the extreme political left with whom I have very little connection, or what have you, or being in prisons with men who were never fathered, and realizing that Jesus wants to be there through us too. And that has challenged me. I'm theologically trained, I've pastored for years. I'm very familiar with church life, but me being able to take hold of Jesus to in turn, in a sense, provide Him to them, provide Him to people in these horrible circumstances. It's one thing to pray for a guy at the altar of a church. It's another thing to pray for him while the chopper is smoking and going down that we're both in. That takes some effort. That's taking hold of Jesus and knowing Him in a different way. So that's been the most profound change for me as a Christian the last years.
So no soldiers no atheists in foxholes, rubber rafts, or helicopters spiraling down?
Not as far as I found. Yeah. Not as far. Now they don't look like your grandma's Christian in some cases, and they certainly don't talk about it. When the chopper's going down, everybody's screaming to Jesus, including the Buddhist guy. He told me 2 hours before he was a Buddhist, and we're going down. He was an African American Buddhist guy, and he's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And I thought, okay, this is how you convert people right here. You shoot down their chopper. But anyway, you understand what was going on. People were grabbing for their roots, so to speak.
Church growth principle.
That's right. Yeah. Shoot down their plane. They will get saved before they hit the ground. I think that's my next book.
Yeah. Questions?
Talk about the transition from pastoring to becoming a published author. And then the second part of that question is, what's the secret to your productivity? You seem very prolific. And what's your schedule like?
I appreciate you asking that. I pastored for 21 years, and all the time that I did, I was convinced I wouldn't pastor forever. Most pastors, once they accept the calling of being a pastor, they think they'll pastor forever. That's fine. If that's what they're called to do, that's great. I think you need to know your seasons, and I always sensed that there would come a moment in my life when I would transition out of pastoring and step more fully out into the culture, maybe we would say, or more fully in confrontation with the values and thought of this world. So that's the transition that I made. And I have to say, it wasn't a big shift for me, because I had always tried to lead the churches that I pastored and conduct myself in a way that was active out there, beyond the borders of the church. We worked a lot in poverty. I, in 1 year, made 12 trips to work with Muslims in Iraq. I wasn't just a hide in the office kind of guy, so it wasn't that big of a shift. What I will say, that what intrigued me once I sort of got out is that how many pastors would come to me and, like I was a drug dealer, and go, how do you get out? you know, like we're in prison trying to dig a hole through the floors. How'd you get over the wall, you know? And it wasn't anything I'd really thought through. But I do realize there may be a lot of people pastoring who don't need to be, and maybe some folks not pastoring who do, but folks don't need to feel trapped by their callings. And I'm eager to see more people out beyond the church, because I think that's partially what the church is about, is equipping people to go do the ministry. Your question about me being prolific as a result of a low IQ. I'm easily distracted, very visual, and I can't do probably what other wonderful authors do, and that's write for a few hours and then go to lunch, come back, write for an hour, and take a meeting. And so my productivity is a result of tyrannically ruling my schedule. When a book comes up, I start blocking off entire days. When I write for an entire day. I get up in the morning, I work out, I have breakfast with my wife, I hide away, and I will stay. It's like getting a 747 aloft. Once it's up, it's not coming down to go to the small town, you know, over in the next state. I stay up all day, so to speak, aloft, writing, and probably 5 or 6, I finally land the plane. When I smell dinner cooking, it's usually when I know the God is speaking, it's time to stop. So I'll write 8, 9, 10 hours straight. I'll take a break for lunch, restroom, whatever. But that's by managing the schedule and by staying aloft once I am aloft, meaning once I'm in the flow, stay there. That's how I get a lot written. So I'll write like that for 3 or 4 days, then I get tired and I go do something else. I'll take a trip to speak or do whatever work I need to do. And then I'll come back around to 3 or 4 days altogether. That's just how it works for me. I know people who write in every possible way. Some people write in bars. P.G. O'Rourke writes in a bar. I have one of my favorite constitutional professors writes naked on his back porch. I mean, at night. Everybody writes in a different way. This is how I have to write. So it means I have to manhandle my schedule. I count words. I count days. It's a very analytical process. I leave myself about 3 or 4 days margin, and I get the book written. It's that boring. But it works for me. I think the key to great writing, one of the keys, is finding your unique way of writing and not assuming that it's the same for everybody.
So you didn't write your book on Guinness in a bar?
No. No, I write almost all the words in an office, but the only thing I'll do on an airplane or out is editing and some research. I'll read for research, but I usually write hidden away. Until Killing Jesus, by the way, when I could not bring myself to write, I have kind of a nice, overstuffed leather furniture kind of office, 100 green walls. And I just couldn't stay there and write the story of the crucifixion of Jesus in this nice, kind of brassy office. So I wrote the entire of Killing Jesus at Union Station in D.C., and in a courthouse, and in a synagogue, and on a hill in Jerusalem, and 3 feet from Netanyahu, because he sat down in the chair next to me for some reason at the King David, and things like that. So that's the only book I've ever written out. Every other book I've written in my office, and I just can't really do it much any other way.
Hi. Thank you. Hi.
Oh, hey.
Hi. Russell Moore of the Southern Baptists talks about how evangelicals should think about being less about a moral majority and more of a prophetic minority. I'm just wondering, what do you think some of your biographical subjects would have said about that? Say Wilberforce or Whitefield, how would they have approached this kind of a question?
It's interesting because Wilberforce had both, and that's how I see it. Wilberforce returned to a group of people who stood with him, helped him tend his wounds, encouraged him, inspired him, and sent him back out to be look like the prophetic minority publicly. So I think we need both. I'm going to articulate the faith out in a culture that doesn't fully accept it, not as fully as they used to. I'm going to be seen as part of a majority. That's fine. Part of minority. But I need the holy huddle. I need the small group. I need the band of brothers to be strengthened and encouraged. We've all seen Christian movements become too much like the parties and the organizations that they were trying to change. And then we've all seen the holy huddle mentality, which is let's all live up on a hill and wait for Jesus to come back and compute the number of red moons or whatever it is that we're trying to figure out about end time prophecy. I almost went really dark there, so excuse me. I tell you what, here's the lesson from my life. It may not be everybody's experience, but here's the lesson from my life. If I will work on knowing my stuff, being gracious, being able to be relatable at a dinner table, caring about people. The doors are much more open to an individual who's willing to be in the homes of people he doesn't agree with than they ever are for someone who wants to stand on the street and shout. Now, there's room for both. There's room for both. But my life has been about having access and relationships and open doors with famous people looking at me and saying, well, you know, you were kind to me. You shook my hand, you looked me in the eye, and you told me you'd be praying for me. And I've never had anybody from your theology say that to me. Now, they could be playing me, but I had access. I ended up having dinner with the guy you wouldn't believe it would ever talk to an evangelical. So I don't think hiding away on a hill waiting for the second coming or storming the gates in anger are the only options, or maybe even the best options. For me, it's been about building relationships, being kind, not compromising. Everybody knows what I believe, but loving people, praying for them, keeping confidences, and getting invited back. And that's where I've had the most impact. So I fear both the mass movement that's somewhat blind and angry, as well as the holy huddle that is retreated, legalistic, and ineffective. I bashed everybody I love, so I think there are other ways to go. And I'm not Mr. Popular, you know, amongst the secular or the left, but I'm with a lot of people you would think would never talk to someone like me. And it's just because I said, I'm sorry to hear about your son, I'll be praying for him. And they just can't believe it. Because the last person they talked to like me said, glad your son is dying because you believe X. And I'm not sure that's what we were called to do. So that's the best murky answer I can give you on that subject at the moment.
Your specialization in biographies of large historical figures would suggest you're a believer in the theory that history is the story of great people. How would you describe your philosophy of history, and what unique contribution do Christians make to the practice?
To the field of history? Yeah. I'm sorry that Christians have abandoned the field of history so much, because some of the great history was written by Christians. And I think a distinctly biblical view of history certainly includes the great man theory, but doesn't exclusively rest upon it. It believes that a sovereign God is working through other forces. So that technology can be a force, so that weather can be a force, so that, you know, mass movements can be a force. Christians wouldn't write just a great man history because that's more of a, you know, Renaissance Enlightenment concept a la Carlyle than a Christian view. So a biblical view of history, of course, is providential. Biblical view of history includes a great deal of mystery. We don't know why things happened, right? A biblical view of history certainly understands how character and morality prevails, understands principles of greatness without believing that God is somehow hedged in by them. It includes the great man and the common man and the mass movement and the poor. And the issue really is who aligns with God and his purposes in the earth. So it blurs all the lines. And I like that because, you know, I don't think God's just messing with us, but whenever somebody says, you know, God will always do so-and-so, I think it's like God walks out of his house, puts on his gym shoes, and gets after messing up that entire idea for you the next day. Do you know what I'm saying? As soon as we say we've got God in a box, or, I mean, there are biblical statements that are eternally true, but God will never do so-and-so, or God is going to strike Obama with a thing. That's the next day he preaches the best sermon you've ever heard in your whole life for Obama. You know, like, wow. It's because God's sovereign, and God's always doing things you don't know. There's more happening for the glory of God on the Hill than you would ever imagine, given what's going on in the news. There's good things happening, terrible things happening, because God's sovereign. God is doing things you don't understand. You're always looking through the glass darkly or at the other side of the tapestry, and you don't know fully what he's doing. So, you know, now I join Lincoln. I just want to be on his side, you know. But I think there is a biblical philosophy of history, at least some pillars, and I think they allow more nuance and mystery than any of these exact. It's always social movements. It's always Marxist. It's always the great man. I think those all fit somehow into a broader biblical view, which includes more mystery, more nuance, less certainty, except about the ways and the will of God.
I didn't ask about several of your books, and you just mentioned Lincoln. And I think you hit it right in discussing the last years of Lincoln and the way he changed. Maybe you could summarize that for folks.
The thing that got me lit up about Lincoln made me write that book, which is my favorite, I think, of all the ones I've written so far. Of course, next week, that'll probably change. But right now, that's my favorite book, is that when historians, great follow-on question to what you just said, when scholarly historians write about Lincoln, he's almost always a non-believer, an atheist, a pagan. When the religious write about Lincoln, he is Billy Graham. You know, he is, you know, whoever. And so he's the perfect ideal Christian man in American history. And I found when I began to go to the sources that neither was true. And some of you are already feeling a little bit of frustration with me in that often I see things, most people see things in black and white. I see things in shades of color. But I think that's where reality falls. So Lincoln was early in his life, won't go into all the details, buy the book. He was, at one point, the village atheist. He had been so influenced by Thomas Paine and Volney and others that he had utterly rejected the gospel, walked around using very harsh language about the person of Jesus, talked about the Christian mythologists like Paine did, etc. But he changed. Scholars have him locked in there. Lincoln married a woman who was Episcopalian, had experienced the death of a son, and a very stout evangelical Presbyterian minister was the primary person who ministered to him at that time. He changed. He started giving money to Christian ministries. He loaned a Baptist pastor's buggy and horse for 2 years. He let his wife go to church, and he attended from time to time himself. Things changed. And so but the Lincoln that entered office was a Lincoln who believed in God, believed in the Bible, believed in biblical truth. Didn't make a lot of statements about Jesus, but he would have sat here and been fine. He would have sat through this entire discussion today and been with us, I think, largely. Was he born again? I don't know. But he was a man who spouted Scripture, read the Bible daily, looked for comfort, and befriended many ministers, and went to church regularly. Never joined a church his whole life. The real progression for Lincoln, I can say it very quickly, happens between the first and second inaugural. The first inaugural, he's a man who believes in God, but he says in the first inaugural to the South, he speaks of them, he says, "Into your hands is this matter of civil war, my departed brethren." He believes that history is basically humanly driven. 4 years later, his second inaugural, Lincoln couldn't buy a victory. He had the largest army, had the most money, had the most munitions. The North should have won the war in the first 6 months and called it done. No, this thing drags on. Lincoln can't buy a victory. Generals lose wars or lose whole battles because they stop for coffee too early. I mean, Lincoln is just haunted by all of this, realizes he's not in charge of events, grapples with himself over the whole issue, grapples with God. In the second inaugural, he's essentially saying that the war was the judgment of God on both sides for the treatment of the black man, and that history is not in human hands. We all tried to fight the war, and here are the powerful words in the second inaugural. We all tried to keep the war from happening, but the war came. Human effort didn't stop it, but the war came. So when Lincoln was done with the second inaugural, a friend complimented him. He said, "It's not going to be very popular." The friend said, "Why?" Lincoln said, "Because people do not like being shown the distance between themselves and God." That's what he thought he was doing in the second inaugural. And in that sense, he was playing small p prophet, right? He was trying to speak God's will to a people. So you go from the village atheist to the guy who is trying to speak God's will to a people. There's some evidence that he was on a deeper Christian journey and might have been baptized sometime later. He was killed before then. I want you to know that in his very last words, he and his wife were continuing a conversation from earlier in the day that you saw in the movie, if you saw the movie, about where they'd spend the time at the end of the war. Lincoln turned to his wife in the box at Ford's Theater and said, "After the war, we will not go back to Springfield. We'll go abroad, perhaps to Europe, so I can rest." He said, "I'd like to go to Jerusalem." He said, "I'd like to go and see the city of the Savior. There's no place I'd like to go see so much as Jerusalem." Bang, John Wilkes Booth's Darren Jabal entered his brain, and he was killed. His last words were, "I would like to go walk in the city of the Savior. I'd like to go to Jerusalem." Mystery, right? Can't draw a conclusion. Don't have a born again. Don't have an appearance on CBN. You understand what I'm saying? I need something solid. We don't have it. So it's the journey that's the thing with Lincoln, and that's what I tried to capture. And I think that we should be willing to admit sometimes when we can't get a historical figure to the altar, we just don't know.
Wilberforce and Churchill, and now you're talking about Lincoln, and alluding to the hardships and trials and even suffering, dark nights of the soul of some of these great men. What have you learned personally in doing your research about the crucible of pain and hardship and suffering in forging greatness?
I'm always reminded when somebody asks me that question of something that Peggy Noonan wrote years ago that I really admired, something that she thought and then wrote. She was watching George W. Bush and Al Gore debate, and she said, she was not careful when she first said it out loud, then later she was careful when she wrote it. When she was driving home, she said to somebody, "I wish they had both suffered more." Well, that sounded like she was saying, "I want you to hurt, I want you to suffer." What she was really saying, as she explained later, was you wanted greater gravitas. You wanted greater heft. You wanted men of greater character, depth, compassion, experience, gravitas. And all the people I have studied and all the people that I know who have done ultimate good in the world and been people of weight and gravitas and strength in a broad generational sense suffered. They knew how to draw from suffering what was necessary to defeat an enemy or rally a people. And we're a generation that fears suffering. We medicate suffering. We think the easy way is the better way to go. But what I put in my books comes from my own suffering, and it hasn't been as severe as the Lincolns. I've not lost a child. Lincoln suffered such horrible depression that they had to go on suicide watch 2 or 3 times in his life. Churchill did too. I don't have that, but I have my own version of suffering. You have your version of suffering, and we ought to let suffering work its perfect work. So there's not any historical figure that I respect and has had, epic sort of impact, who did not learn the art of drawing out the lessons of the dark night of the soul, farming the valleys is another phrase, of bringing to the public arena the lessons they had learned in their private sufferings. And it's an art. The lightweight run from suffering, and the perpetually distressed build an idol to suffering and stay around it all the time. But great leaders know how to suffer and draw the lessons out for victory in a better day, or a more public day, and that's what they all did. It's a direct line between every great act of Churchill's or every great battle that he crafted victory in, and something he conquered in himself. Lincoln, somewhat the same way. Others, and so it's something. There are books to be written and whole courses to be taught in our leadership coaching efforts on how to approach suffering. Avoid it if you can, but if you can't, face it and allow it to have its perfect work. I'm sorry?
Message there for the Christian?
Well, the Christian above all people, a Christian who believes in a sovereign God, Paul said it in writing to the Thessalonians, "Don't be distressed by my sufferings. I was destined for them," the NIV says. Other translations come close. I was made for this. I was called to this. So a Christian should be embracing that lesson more than perhaps any other people. It's not only is it overtly said in our book, the book by which we ought to be patterning our lives, but it's the conclusion of living a life that's ruled by a sovereign God, and that is intended to break into a sinful world with the gospel. You're going to suffer. You're going to hurt. I mean, on your refrigerator ought to be, "All who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." The other scripture you got to stick on your refrigerator, and right next to the picture of the Lamborghini you're hoping for and the woman you hope to marry, is that you must go through many difficulties to enter the kingdom. These are promises. These are statements from God, and so. Yeah, this is not just something we Christians ought to absorb. This is something we Christians ought to be the masters of. How do you suffer, be made better by suffering, and achieve victories out of suffering and because of what's been worked in you through suffering? I think it's extremely important.
2 other books we haven't talked about, and briefly, what did you learn in the course of writing about Oprah? And let's conclude with what did you learn in the course of writing about killing Jesus?
Killing Jesus first. I learned in writing about killing Jesus that you cannot trademark a title in America. and that so somebody else with a massive media juggernaut can roll over you. I'm playing. I decided to write Killing Jesus long before Brother O'Reilly had come out with even Killing Kennedy. Had no idea he was going to go further, had no idea he was going to go to the topic of Jesus. Love that I got to write this book. Love the cultural dialogue that's happening right now with Reza Aslan's book on Zealot, called Zealot, my book, Bill O'Reilly's book. And it profoundly changed me. I had heard a great lecture by a Vatican scholar when I was in college about the crucifixion. He started by saying, whatever you think you know, you don't know. And he broke down the biology and the medical side and the legal side, and it was pretty, pretty wonderful. So I paid attention to those themes throughout the years, but when I finally had a chance to write this book called Killing Jesus and really dive into it and bring the scholarship to the fore and maybe be answering the new atheists a little bit. You know, they say light things that aren't true, like, well, there's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. Just silly. So I decided I wanted to write something cool, contemporary, first-person omniscient narrative voice, but something that would have heft academically. So I put all the footnotes in the back, and then I wrote this kind of novel sort of narrative. I'm thrilled I got to do it. It's opening tremendous doors. And an interesting little side note, I know he might see this, but he knows I love him. Mr. O'Reilly made some rather liberal statements, some rather non-traditional statements in his book about killing Jesus. On the first page, he says, Gospels aren't really history. And second page, he says, Jesus didn't say everything on the cross that the Bible says he said. So he got himself in hot water. So the book sold big because he had but what's happening is his book is prompting real questioning of people's lives, and Bill wrote sort of a murder mystery. Well, I've written, not better, not worse, I'm not claiming anything like that, but I've at least gone to the heart of the story as Jewish and Roman writings support the New Testament descriptions. I'm orthodox on Scripture. I'm orthodox on the crucifixion, so to speak. And so it's interesting, there's such a dialogue and such a hunger going on in our society that my book sold well because it was out 6 months earlier. Then he beat me like a bad behaving thing. And then my book's rising and his book is decreasing. I don't want anybody's book to decrease. I want my books to rise. And the reason that as we kind of check into now, why is my book selling more, is because people want the rest of the story. They want to dive deeper. So this is real. You're being encouraged by the fact that even Reza Aslan's book on Zealot, which is a very sort of traditional, left-leaning, scholarly look at the life of Jesus, raises questions that it doesn't answer. So my experience with Killing Jesus has been profound. The final book that you asked about was Oprah. There's a lot of reasons to like Oprah. I'm sure if she was here, we'd have a fascinating conversation. Hopefully she'd buy dinner. But Oprah angered me somewhat because she had this traditional African-American church audience, and then she took them. She said, oh, keep your religion. Be Baptist, be Methodist, be whatever you are. I want to talk to you about spirituality. And then she talked to you about how to chant, light candles, and envision, and believe in karma, and so on. And that's a lie, basically. Hey, keep your religion, but I'm going to make you a Hindu. Keep your religion, but I'm going to make you a New Ager. So by way of looking at the whole boomer experience, I kind of took her on gently, lovingly. I don't write attack books. And that's been one of the most fascinating discussions I've had, because I'll attend a conservative Baptist church, but have the woman who loves Oprah just go after me in the lobby or something. And people, if something is culturally sweet or there's any good at all in an idea, people will accept the whole and never be discriminating. So are good things about Oprah? Sure, I can join her in an anti-rape campaign, for example, for heaven's sakes, or domestic abuse. But that doesn't mean everything she's saying spiritually is true, and I think that's tainted our society. Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
My privilege.
Okay, thanks everybody for being here. Thank you so much for that fascinating discussion. Be here Monday, where we will have really the major spokesman for the evangelical left, Ron Sider, and have a conversation with him. So that will be tremendous. In the meantime, please thank Stephen Mansfield.